Hello, this is Somnistry Stories. Tonight, the rain sings its quiet lullaby, and the rocking chair moves in time with the night. Aunt Sylvie's hands work calmly, and all you need to do is close your eyes and relax. The rain had been falling since morning, not in urgent bursts, but with a steady patience that seemed to whisper secrets to the earth. Each droplet followed its predetermined path from cloud to leaf to ground, creating a gentle symphony that filled the evening air with its hushed melody. On the screened-in porch of the old farmhouse, Aunt Sylvie sat in her wicker rocking chair, counting stitches in a whisper that matched the cadence of the raindrops. 1 pearl, 2 knit, 3 pearl. Her silver hair was braided into a crown that circled her head like a halo, and her round wire-frame glasses caught the fading evening light as she worked. The weathered floorboards beneath her creaked gently with each rock of her chair. Creak, pause, creak, pause. A metronome marking time as twilight settled over the land. 14 pearl, 15 knit, 16 pearl. She continued, her fingers moving with practiced precision. The soft green yarn grew longer between her wooden needles, transforming into something warm and useful with each passing minute. Click-clack went the needles, a counterpoint to the patter of rain and the creak of her chair. The porch itself seemed to breathe with contentment, its peeling white paint and warped wooden planks telling stories of summers past. A braided rag rug of red, blue and yellow strips lay beneath Aunt Sylvie's feet, adding a splash of muted colour to the peaceful scene. Against the wall, a tea tray waited patiently. A chipped porcelain teapot, a honey dipper rested in a small ceramic dish, and a sprig of fresh mint in a mason jar, ready to be steeped when the moment called for it. As Sylvie reached the end of a row, she adjusted her glasses twice, pushing them gently up the bridge of her nose with her index finger. She blew softly on her knitting needles, as if making a wish on birthday candles, sending a stray thread floating into the air where it caught the light, before settling onto the crocheted throw, draped over the arm of her chair. The rain continued its gentle patter on the roof, creating a blanket of white noise that wrapped around the porch like a cocoon. Out beyond the screen, the oak trees stood sentinel, their leaves glistening with moisture, occasionally releasing a heavy droplet that fell with a satisfying plop onto the wet ground below. The distant hills were shrouded in a fine mist, their outlines softened and dreamlike in the fading light. 1 pearl, 2 knit, 3 pearl. Aunt Sylvie began her count again, her voice barely audible above the rain. The rocking chair maintained its steady rhythm. Creak, pause, creak, pause. Her weathered hands moved with calm purpose, the green yarn flowing through her fingers like water. Outside, the world was growing darker as evening transitioned to twilight. The rain-soaked landscape took on deeper hues, the green of the oaks turning to emerald, the brown earth darkening to umber. With the coming of darkness, the scent of wet oak leaves began to rise, a rich, earthy aroma that spoke of growth and renewal. It was the smell of life itself, of leaves decomposing into soil, of nutrients returning to the earth from which they came. This petrichor, the scent of rain on dry earth, mingled with the sweeter fragrance of honeysuckle that grew along the fence line, creating a perfume that no bottled scent could ever capture. Aunt Sylvie breathed it in deeply, a small smile forming at the corners of her mouth as she continued to rock and knit. Her rocking chair answered with its familiar creak. Pause. Creak. Pause. The wooden wind chime in the corner of the porch, carved into the shapes of small birds, hung motionless, waiting for the slightest breath of air to bring it to life. After completing another row, Sylvie adjusted her glasses twice and set aside her knitting for a moment. She reached for the teapot, lifting it with careful hands. The sound of liquid trickling into a cup joined the ambient chorus of rain and creaking chair. The teacup clinked softly against its saucer as she settled it on the small table beside her. Steam rose from the amber liquid, carrying the fragrance of chamomile and mint to mingle with the petrichor from outside. As Sylvie sipped her tea, a soft humming escaped her lips, the familiar melody of All the Pretty Little Horses, a lullaby as old as the hills themselves. The tune wove itself into the tapestry of sounds. The rain, the chair, the click-clack of knitting needles that would soon resume their work. Her humming faded naturally, like the last notes of a music box winding down, and she returned her teacup to its saucer with a gentle clink. Taking up her needles once more, she resumed her count. 17 purl, 18 knit, 19 purl. The click-clack of wooden needles joined the symphony of evening sounds again, and the chair continued its steady creak. Pause. Creak. Pause. It was then that something caught Sylvie's eye. A small, spinning object descending from above. A maple seed, freed from its branch by the weight of collected raindrops, danced through the air in a perfect spiral. Its single wing caught what little remained of the day's light, creating a mesmerizing pattern as it twirled downward like a miniature ballerina performing a solo in the rain. The seed spun closer to the porch, carried by a gentle current of air until it reached the screen. There it landed, its damp surface adhering to the mesh, with a delicate precision that seemed almost intentional. The seed's wing extended outward, its veins forming an intricate pattern against the screen. A tiny map of rivers and tributaries etched in nature's careful hand. Sylvie's knitting slowed as her attention was drawn to this small visitor. The maple seed, no larger than her thumbnail, clung to the screen at eye level, as if presenting itself for her appreciation. In its simple form lay the complexity of life, the blueprint for an entire tree contained within its humble shell. The rain had darkened the seed to a rich, coffee brown, highlighting the texture of its surface against the grey mesh of the screen. For a moment, the only movement on the porch was the rising steam from Sylvie's teacup and the barely perceptible expansion and contraction of her chest as she breathed. Even her rocking chair seemed to pause in reverence for this small miracle of nature, a seed that might, with time and fortune, become a towering maple, spreading its canopy over future generations. The wind chime in the corner of the porch had remained silent throughout the evening, its wooden bird suspended in mid-flight, their movement arrested by the stillness of the air. But now, as if acknowledging the maple seed's arrival, a single, isolated breeze found its way through the screen. This solitary breath of wind, too gentle to disturb the rain's pattern or rustle the leaves on the oak trees, was just sufficient to set the lowest bird of the chime in motion. The carved wooden bird touched its neighbour with the softest of contacts, creating a single, clear note that rang out across the porch. The sound was neither loud nor prolonged, but in the ambient tapestry of rain and creaking chair, it registered as distinct and perfect, a brief, melodic counterpoint to the rhythm of the evening. The note hung in the air for 3 seconds, perhaps 4, before dissolving back into the general chorus of raindrops. Sylvie looked up from her knitting toward the source of the sound, her gaze travelling from the wind chime to the maple seed, and back again, as if the two were engaged in a conversation to which she was privileged to listen. The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidental, the seed arriving just before the chime's solitary note, as if nature had choreographed a miniature performance for an audience of one. The ceiling fan above Aunt Sylvie's head turned in slow, deliberate circles, its wooden blades catching the last remnants of daylight. With each rotation came a faint click-click, not an intrusive sound, but rather a reassuring marker of time passing, like the second hand of an old clock. The fan's gentle movement created the slightest stir in the air, enough to make the loose strands of silver hair around Sylvie's temples dance with each turn. Beyond the porch, the rain-soaked world settled deeper into twilight. The distant hills were now mere silhouettes against a sky the colour of lavender and slate. The oak trees stood as patient sentinels, their leaves collecting raindrops until the weight became too much, causing them to release their burden in a synchronized shower that pattered onto the ground below. This created a secondary rhythm distinct from the steady rain, a sporadic, yet somehow predictable chorus of larger drops falling from leaf to earth. Sylvie's hands, with their prominent veins and sun-spotted skin, returned to the familiar motions of knitting after this momentary pause. Unlike the hurried hands of younger knitters, hers possessed a deliberate calm that came from decades of practice. There was no rush in her movements, no anxious energy to complete the task. The green yarn unspooled from the willow basket beside her chair at a measured pace, becoming something new with each passing minute. 27 purl, 28 knit, 29 purl. Her counting resumed after a brief pause, the words floating on her breath like dandelion seeds on a summer breeze. The wooden needles in her hands caught what little light remained in the deepening dusk, their polished surfaces gleaming momentarily before returning to shadow. On the table beside Sylvie, the tea had cooled enough that it no longer released visible steam. The surface of the amber liquid was still now, reflecting the dim light like a mirror. The sprig of mint leaned against the inside of the cup, its leaves darkened from steeping. A single drop of honey had crystallized on the rim, catching what little light remained and holding it like a tiny amber jewel. The tabby cat, Whisker, made his presence known not through appearance, but through sound. The soft padding of paws along the hallway inside, approaching the screen door that led to the porch. A gentle thump against the wooden frame, followed by a barely audible meow, signaled his arrival. Although he did not enter, his proximity added another comforting presence to the scene, another living being sharing the peaceful moment. Night had nearly completed its transition now, the last vestiges of daylight surrendering to darkness. The rain continued its gentle cadence, but its sound had changed subtly as day became night, somehow deeper, more resonant in the darkness. The raindrops no longer caught the light as they fell. Instead, they were felt and heard rather than seen, becoming part of the invisible dance of evening. The maple seed remained affixed to the screen, its damp surface creating a perfect seal against the fine mesh. In the deepening twilight, its silhouette formed a graceful shape, part wing, part vessel, a simple design perfected over countless generations. Water droplets collected along its edge, catching what little light remained and transforming into miniature prisms that held moments of rainbow color before releasing their burden in tiny rivulets down the screen. Sylvie's gaze lingered on the seed, not with urgency or active curiosity, but with the patient attention of someone who understood that quiet observation was its own reward. The green yarn continued to flow through her fingers as she knitted, her hands finding their own way through the familiar pattern, while her eyes rested on this small visitor from the maple tree that stood at the edge of the garden, just visible from her place on the porch. The wooden wind chime had returned to stillness after its solitary note. The carved birds once again suspended in their silent flight. Their painted details had faded with years of exposure to changing seasons. Yet this softening of colour somehow enhanced their beauty, giving them the appearance of birds glimpsed through morning mist. The largest bird, a cardinal with traces of red still visible on its wings, hung slightly lower than the others, having been the one to sound the gentle note that had briefly joined the evening's quiet symphony. The rain's rhythm had settled into a steady, hypnotic pattern, neither increasing nor decreasing in intensity. It was the kind of rain that could continue through the night, nourishing the soil without overwhelming it. Each droplet finding its place in the greater cycle of moisture that sustained the hills and valleys surrounding Aunt Sylvie's home. From somewhere in the distance came the soft, hollow sound of water flowing through the farm's drainage ditches. A low, pleasant murmur that spoke of systems working as intended, of thoughtful design harmonizing with natural processes. 36 pearl, 37 knit, 38 pearl. Sylvie's counting had resumed after her moment of observation, her voice barely rising above the sound of rainfall. The familiar numbers created their own form of meditation, a rhythmic focusing of thought that allowed her mind to be both engaged and at rest simultaneously. The slight pressure of wooden needles against her fingertips provided a tactile anchor to the present moment, while the emerging pattern in the yarn connected her to a tradition of handwork that extended both backward and forward in time. The ceiling fan continued its unhurried rotation, moving the air in gentle currents that carried the mingled scents of rain, tea, and yarn throughout the enclosed porch. The motion was just sufficient to keep the atmosphere from becoming too still, adding a dynamic element to the peaceful scene without creating disturbance. With each revolution came the faint click-click that had become so familiar. It registered more as presence than as sound, like the breathing of a trusted companion. Whisker, having made his earlier announcement without entering, now reconsidered his decision. The screen door hinges released a soft sigh as the tabby pushed his way onto the porch with deliberate movements. His paws made no sound on the wooden boards as he approached Sylvie's chair, his eyes reflecting what little light remained in twin golden orbs. Without hurry or demand, he settled himself beneath the rocking chair, finding the precise spot where he would be near his human companion, yet safe from the chair's gentle motion. The braided rug beneath Sylvie's feet had gathered the day's subtle changes within its woven strands. Morning sunshine, afternoon shadows, and now evening dampness had all been absorbed by the fabric, creating a textile diary of the hours past. The blue section, once her nephew's overalls, seemed to hold the moisture most readily, darkening to a shade that matched the twilight sky visible through the screen. The rug's circular pattern spiraled outward like ripples in a pond, creating a center of warmth and color in the increasingly shadowed porch. In the distance, an owl called once, a single soft note that blended so perfectly with the evening that it might have been overlooked entirely had Sylvie not been attuned to the subtle variations in her surroundings. The sound came from the direction of the old barn, where a family of barn owls had nested for generations, their presence a welcome constant through changing seasons. This was not the sharp, questioning call sometimes heard later in the night, but rather a gentle acknowledgement of the transition from day to evening, a marking of time as natural as the deepening shadows. Sylvie paused in her knitting long enough to set her work in her lap and reach for her teacup once more. The tea had cooled to room temperature now, yet still carried the pleasant flavour of chamomile and mint, perhaps even enhanced by the time it had spent gathering the evening air. She sipped slowly, allowing the liquid to rest on her tongue for a moment before swallowing, appreciating the subtle complexity of flavor that developed as the herbs continued their gentle infusion. The maple seed on the screen shifted almost imperceptibly as a drop of collected water became too heavy and released its hold, sliding down the mesh in a zigzagging path. This minute movement caught Sylvie's eye once more, drawing her attention to how the seed's position created a small interruption in the otherwise uniform pattern of the screen. Such imperfections, never unwelcome, added texture and interest to the familiar view, like unexpected notes in a well-known melody. Beyond the screen porch, the garden beds that Sylvie had tended earlier in the season now received the rain with open embrace. The soil, rich with years of careful amendment, absorbed the moisture at a steady rate, neither allowing puddles to form nor rejecting the offering of hydration. Rows of late-season vegetables stood in orderly formation, their leaves collecting droplets until the weight caused them to release their burden in a pattern that mimicked the larger trees surrounding the property. The knitting in Sylvie's lap had grown substantially since she began. What had started as a few rows now cascaded over her knees in gentle folds, the pattern of raised stitches creating a topography of valleys and ridges that caught shadows in their recesses. The green yarn, the colour of sage leaves in early summer, formed a pleasant contrast to the deeper hues of evening that now dominated the porch. There was no urgency to complete the project. It would take exactly as long as was needed, each stitch adding to the whole in its own time. Whisker had begun a subtle, rhythmic purring from his position beneath the chair, the sound so soft and low that it registered more as vibration than as audible noise. This gentle rumbling added another layer to the evening soundscape, a living counterpoint to the rain and the creaking chair. The cat's contentment was a simple thing, born of security and companionship, requiring nothing more than the presence of his person and the knowledge of shelter from the rain. The wooden wind chime stirred once more, though no breeze was perceptible to human senses. Perhaps it responded to air currents too subtle for awareness, or perhaps the accumulated moisture on its carved birds had shifted their delicate balance. Whatever the cause, the result was a whispered touch of wood against wood, not quite substantial enough to create a true note, but sufficient to suggest the possibility of music. The sound faded almost before it registered, like the memory of a dream upon waking. Time continued its unhurried passage on the porch, marked not by clocks or schedules, but by the gradual deepening of shadows, the slow cooling of tea, the increasing length of knitted fabric. The transition from day to night proceeded without fanfare or announcement, each moment flowing seamlessly into the next like water moving downstream, finding its natural course without effort or direction. Sylvie's rocking chair maintained its steady rhythm. Creak, pause, creak, pause, creating a foundation upon which all other movements and sounds were built. The weathered wood had learned its path over countless evenings. the runners finding the same grooves in the porch floor with each forward and backward motion. Like breath or heartbeat, this rhythm continued without conscious thought, reliable as the turning of the earth or the phases of the moon. 54 pearl, 55 knit, 56 pearl. The counting had acquired a dreamlike quality now, the words emerging from Sylvie more as exhalation than as deliberate speech. The numbers no longer served only as instruction, but had become a mantra of sorts, a steady procession of sound that joined with rain and creaking chair to create a cocoon of gentle, predictable rhythm. Within this cocoon, thoughts could drift like leaves on a slow-moving stream, neither forced nor restrained, but simply allowed to be. The maple seed on the screen had become a familiar presence now, integrated into the evening's landscape as completely as the wind chime or the braided rug. What had arrived as a visitor was now, for this brief time, part of the porch's collection of small wonders, objects that bridge the boundary between the natural world and human space, between the wild and the domesticated. Tomorrow it might be gone, carried away by wind or rain to continue its journey. But for now, it belonged to this quiet moment, this gentle transition from day to night. The evening had deepened into full night now, the transition complete yet so gradual that no single moment could be identified as the turning point. The darkness outside the porch was not absolute, but rather a rich tapestry of varying shades. The deeper black of tree trunks against the softer charcoal of rain-washed sky. The silvery outlines of wet leaves catching what little ambient light remained. This natural chiaroscuro created a living painting beyond the screen, one that shifted subtly with each gust of rain and gentle movement of foliage. Inside the porch, the darkness gathered in corners and beneath furniture, softening edges and blending shapes into more general forms. Sylvie's hands, still moving steadily through their familiar knitting motions, now worked more by touch than by sight, her fingers knowing the path of yarn and needles through decades of practice. The green of the yarn was no longer visually distinct, but remained known to her through its texture and weight, its particular tension as it passed through her fingers and formed into orderly rows. 71 pearl, 72 knit, 73 pearl. The counting continued, though softer now, almost more thought than speech. The numbers flowed like the rain, like the rocking of the chair, a constant that anchored the present moment while allowing it to drift simultaneously. There was no hurry to reach a particular number, no goal beyond the process itself. Each stitch existed for its own sake, complete in its singular purpose. Whisker had settled into deeper relaxation beneath the chair. His breathing slowed to the unhurried rhythm of near sleep. Occasionally, one ear would turn slightly at a sound from outside, acknowledging the world beyond without feeling any need to investigate it. His fur had dried from any dampness acquired on his journey to the porch, now holding the subtle warmth that made cats such welcome companions on cool evenings. This warmth radiated upward, joining the cocoon of comfort that surrounded Sylvie in her chair. The maple seed remained fixed to the screen, now more a silhouette than a detailed object. What had earlier been clearly visible as wing and vessel, veins and surface, was now a simple dark shape against the slightly less dark background of night. Yet this simplification didn't diminish its presence. Rather, it distilled the seed to its essential form, a promise contained within a boundary, potential waiting in perfect patience for the right conditions to emerge. The rain continued its steady patter on the roof, though now the individual droplets had blended into a continuous murmur that rose and fell in subtle waves, like breath or tide. This sound had become so consistent that it registered more as absence would have, a foundation upon which all other sounds were built. The wooden boards of the porch had absorbed the dampness from the air, expanding slightly with the moisture, creating an even deeper resonance to Sylvie's rocking chair as it moved in its familiar arc. The wind chime had been silent for some time now, the carved birds hanging motionless in the still air. Yet their presence remained an integral part of the porch's atmosphere, a visual reminder of the possibility of music even in silence. The polished wood gleamed faintly in what little light remained, the smooth surfaces holding memories of the hands that had carved them, of all the notes they had sounded over countless rainy evenings like this one. Sylvie's teacup sat empty on the small table beside her, the last drop long since consumed. A faint ring of moisture marked where it had rested, a temporary record of this particular evening that would evaporate by morning, leaving no trace of its existence. The sprig of mint that had flavoured the tea lay softly against the porcelain interior, its oils released, its purpose fulfilled, now resting in the quiet satisfaction of completion. The crocheted throw draped over the arm of the rocking chair remained within easy reach, though Sylvie had not yet felt the need to draw it around her shoulders. The evening held a perfect balance of coolness and warmth, the air fresh enough to feel clean in the lungs, yet not so cold as to create discomfort. This equilibrium was one of the gifts of the screen porch, a space that offered shelter without separation, connection without exposure. The knitting in Sylvie's lap had grown substantial now, cascading over her knees and reaching toward the wooden floor. The pattern that had begun as mere suggestion was now clearly established, a series of interconnected diamonds that created texture and visual interest within the uniform green of the yarn. There was no hurry to complete it. The project would continue for as many evenings as it required, each session adding to the whole in unhurried increments. Sylvie's rocking had slowed imperceptibly over the hours, the rhythm now more gradual, the pauses between movements slightly extended. This was not due to fatigue, but rather to the natural mellowing of activity that comes with deep contentment, with the absence of any need to rush or strive or achieve. The chair responded accordingly, its creaking softer, its motion smoother, as if it too were settling into the profound peace of the rainy night. 82 pearl, 83 knit, 84 pearl. The counting had become so quiet now that it might have been mistaken for the sound of breathing, for the whispered passage of rain through leaves. The numbers themselves had lost their significance as markers or instructions, becoming instead a form of gentle communion between hands and yarn, between intention and creation, between the self and the moment. Beyond the screen, the rain-soaked world had settled into its nighttime configuration, a landscape more sensed than seen, more known than observed. The oak trees, the garden beds, the distant hills, all continued their patient existence in the darkness, held in the gentle embrace of rainfall. There were no boundaries between these elements now, no clear delineations where one form ended and another began. In the darkness and rain, all was unified in a single continuous presence. The night deepened further, the hours moving with the same unhurried pace as Sylvie's rocking chair. There was no sense of time wasted or lost, no anxiety about what remained undone or what might come next. This moment on the porch existed as a complete world unto itself, requiring nothing beyond its own quiet unfolding, asking nothing but gentle attention to its simple pleasures. The sound of rain, the feel of yarn, the presence of companionable silence. In this perfect equilibrium of being, Sylvie continued her knitting, her weathered hands moving with a wisdom that comes only from years of practice. The maple seed remained affixed to the screen, a silent witness to the evening's gentle passage. Whisker curled more tightly in his spot beneath the chair, his breathing deep and even. The wooden wind chime hung motionless, holding the potential for music within its carved birds. The rain continued its steady cadence, wrapping the porch in a blanket of consistent sound. Sylvie's knitting needles tapped slower now, lazy as the dripping eaves, while the rain sang the porch to sleep, and the night stretched on.